Hey guys, I suppose by the title of the video, most may get the idea of what this video would be. You may be saying to yourself, yeah, I've heard stuff like this before. Noob Dark Souls player talks about how hard Dark Souls is, how it changed the way they see gaming, how it brought qualities out of them that they never knew they had, etc., etc., blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, that's essentially what this video is, to tell you the truth. Dark Souls did essentially change my life. Quite eccentric and lambasted, you may say, to say that a video game changed your life. I mean, that's nerdier than even most nerds could say what is nerdy, and you'd probably be right. I won't go too far and say such things like Dark Souls is more than a game. It indeed is, but like most well thought out games, there's a lot more to it. Obviously, most of you watching this video know what the most central theme of the Souls games are: death. And it imbues everything: its story, its progress, its player learning system, and its style and tone. But most importantly, it's also what drives the player, which makes it a total unique experience that no game has been able to achieve. We can start with the obvious about Dark Souls and say that it's definitely not your typical casual game where you can breeze through a few missions at a time until you beat it. It's obviously not that. Dark Souls, in its pure sense, is a test. A unique experience for sure, but most assuredly, it's a test. It's a test of many things, you could say. Your experience as a player, your patience, your drive to get to the end of a boss fight, whatever it is. And Dark Souls makes this test hard. Really hard. Dark Souls leaves little room for error, and committing these errors leads to lasting consequences. One could arguably say that the majority of the difficulty lies in the combat between enemies and bosses. But even outside of battle, the game doesn't offer much of a reprieve as you're trekking across the area. Living up to its namesake, a lot of the places are dark, given an ambience of extreme caution and care. There are traps and hidden enemies everywhere, and you may find yourself, unfairly at times, be the victim of gravity's wrath. A lot of places are precarious with steep ledges and thin high-up walkways and paths, and if wading through poisonous swamps or dodging fireballs from the sky doesn't immediately kill you, you can be sure something else will. With the individual bonfires serving as checkpoints as you progress, finding one is equivalent to coming up for air after being underwater for a long period of time. The game will even trick you at times, or mislead you into thinking that happiness is right around the corner, when in actuality, it's another large area with daunting enemies spread everywhere. Even the scarce number of NPCs that you come across have their own fair share of problems, with most coming across as partially insane. And for those few who are actually helpful to you, they too, depending on how you play the game, are essentially facing their own peril at every turn. So essentially, it literally feels like the creators did everything they possibly could to give you the hardest time ever. You'll get frustrated, you'll rage quit a few times, you'll scream at the TV, and for some, you may even give up. But in the end, once you finally succeed, it's what makes the game rewarding from a personal perspective. You may not have had any kind of closure or explanations thrown your way, but you, as a player, still succeeded, and coming down from that high you were just at is like no other feeling ever. And it's only after you do this over and over again does your entire mental state begin to change. This branches into our next topic. Beyond the difficulty of the game lies a seemingly overlooked quality: its tone. Without even having taken one single step in the first dungeon, and having only the knowledge I had about the game's reputation, I found myself constantly second-guessing my choices during the character creation segment. Most Dark Souls fans will tell you character class doesn't initially matter in the long term, as your stats can be tailored to whatever playstyle you want. But I swear I was here for nearly 2 hours, trying to research different combinations, which stats were the most useful, and most importantly, the gift that you can choose at the beginning. It was in this time that I essentially got the gist of most of the items and tactics that I would need or be using the most when playing the game. But even this long preparation didn't prepare me for what was to come. Going back into the battle mechanics of the game and how the player feels so small amongst waves of impossible tasks, does one start to feel the desolation, despair, and solidarity that Dark Souls encompasses so well. You may wonder, understandably, why anyone would want to feel this way. The answer is simple. If video games are meant to be about living out a simulated experience, and the aim of Dark Souls is meant to make you feel lost, confused, and defeated, but then victorious when you push through it, then it succeeds as a game in my opinion. While these feelings themselves were sometimes sitting on the fence between darkness and despair, in my real life, it felt joyous to look back on what all I had been through and accomplished. Like an epic tale that I lived through, despite how difficult the journey. That sticks with you. You have this deeper understanding of exactly what you went through, and it's only really shared with those who beat the game, an understood sense of respect, if you will. Anyway, I digress. Going back to the beginning. Having spent all that time trying to create a somewhat similar looking avatar to my own face and body, it was immediately squandered when my character woke up in a dungeon, looking zombified, eyeless, and sinewy. Was this look only temporary? Was my character cursed? Was I dead? Here's where the next beauty of Dark Souls comes in. The constant air of mystery it has about it, and the fact that wanting to know the story involves you having to do your own investigation. This too, I knew, was an aspect of the Souls games. Its backstory and lore, mostly through item, weapon, and armor description, and with the advent of internet and YouTube, almost nothing about the story hasn't been covered somewhere. This is where Dark Souls truly became a journey for me. I essentially knew nothing starting out, and I knew the game wasn't going to hold my hand. I was on my own, but I was immersed, having the knowledge at my fingertips anytime I wanted. You see, without trying to toot my own horn here, my experience with video games is quite long and broad. Like everyone, I have my favorites, and all of them share special places in my heart, but even they couldn't do what Dark Souls did to me. For the next few weeks, I was thinking about Dark Souls. I was waking up thinking about Dark Souls. I was going to sleep thinking about Dark Souls. I was dreaming about Dark Souls. And I was reading any and all things Dark Souls. No video game has ever done this to me, at least not in the way Dark Souls did. Despite the world's desolation and gloom, I felt like I wanted to be there. Essentially, I got Dark Souls fever and was hooked. But the one caveat about Dark Souls is that for many, getting hooked can take a while, and is usually indicative of how you are as a player. Dark Souls took me about 90 hours to beat, but nearly 25 of those hours were spent between the first few areas, namely the Undead Asylum and Undead Burg areas. I was still figuring out things like battle tactics, magic and healing mechanics, farming items and souls, and essentially breaking down and unlearning everything I knew as a player, and then building myself back up again with a more refined sense of skill. It was only once I beat the 2 gargoyles at the top of the cathedral did Dark Souls finally take off for me. And once it did, I couldn't stop. It didn't entirely make things easier, of course, but I knew what the game expected of me now, and that's what Dark Souls does. It challenges your conventions as a player, as a person even, and despite its overwhelming ruthlessness and frequent unfair situations, it wants you to succeed and help you figure out more about your own humanity.